Okay, so I made this like quick agenda so that you guys know what we're going to be doing today before we just like jump right into the exam question. So, okay. So first, since it's free week and I know maybe not everybody's a MISO member yet, I just want to let you guys know that the reason why I have these coding times is just so that we can go over previous exams. That's how coding times have always been structured. There will be other like meetings that I have where we do like review sessions on just like general concepts, but for Tuesday and Thursday, right, 1:30 to 2:30, it'll just be like I pull up an exam and we just go through the whole thing together. And so that's how the coding times are always going to be structured. In regards of your coding environment, if you don't already have one, then I'd recommend to get Sublime if you want to like follow along with me. You can just go to the like type up Sublime download on Google and then download it. And then whenever you're working on an exam, just change your view to JavaScript. And then, okay, so we did that. And then to access the exams, you guys probably know to go onto his syllabus and access his old exams. They're all on the same date as when your exam is, which is October 13th. And then once I finish this question, I'll show you guys how you can download, like how to download his exam and put your code in there to make sure it works. And then from today's video, so on Tuesday, I'm not going to refer back too much to what we did on Tuesday in case you guys didn't watch that video or weren't there. But for today's question, there's more HTML involved. So hopefully by the end of this coding time, you guys will be more familiar with HTML attributes and how to incorporate them into your tags. And then we'll also be going over for loops, like nested for loops specifically, and the sequence of it. And then checking, so if statement, that's pretty big in today's question as well. So if any of those you're unfamiliar with, or yeah, you just don't know it, those are things we're going to be covering today. And then after that, there were some questions that people asked in the last coding time that I wrote down, and I thought they'd be important to address for today's like video. And then I'll show you guys how to access the resources and practice problems that I made on our MISO app. And then if you have any questions at the very end, either about the exam or about TP or whatever, you can ask it there. But does anybody have any questions right now? And also, if you have anything in the chat, I won't be able to see it. So if you could just unmute and ask a question, that'd be helpful.
I got you. But where are these recordings posted at?
So they're on the MISO app. If you go to education, and then it'll take you to, so if I click on it, it's going to take you to YouTube. So they're all on the, oh shoot, they're on the MISO Java education YouTube. So since it's free week, these are available to everyone. So if you go on the Java YouTube account, there's a playlist for TP coding times as well.
The app, is that just on your website, the MISO app?
Yeah, member.miso.org. You can access it on your phone as well.
Got you.
And does anybody else have any questions? How do I move this? Okay. Okay, if not, that's totally cool. We could just get into the exam now that we covered like the agenda. So I'll pull this up on the side. Okay. So for today's question, we will be creating this like checkerboard table. And essentially what's going to happen is a user is going to type in a number, and we're going to take that number, and with JavaScript, we're going to make a table that is the same number of rows and columns as whatever that number is. So it's 2 bytes of a text box size, and we're going to write the JavaScript function that will retrieve that value. And then if the value of it is even, it's going to give you a display on your browser saying that the size must be odd. And then this is just going to be empty string, so there's not going to be any table. And then if the value that they put in is odd, then we're going to make this table, and we have to check again where, so while we're in the scope of the table, we're going to be doing some more like checks so that we can format it in the way where we get these blank cells in the right spots. So for example, say I want to type in like 12, it's going to say the size has to be odd, and then we're not going to get anything. And then if I type in 15, we get a 15 by 15 table. Okay. And okay, yeah. So on our JavaScript or on our Sublime or text editor, we can start by opening up the function. And what that does is everything in the scope of these brackets is just going to be for this specific question. And this is just important for when you're copying your code onto his code. So it's just function, and then the P2 is the ID for this specific question. So the first deliverable is saying, retrieve the value of SZ from this text box. So all we're going to do is whatever number they put in, we're going to take that and store it in a variable called, we'll call it SZ. So we're going to create a variable, name it SZ. And when you are retrieving like any sort of data from a web page, that data is just HTML content, right? So we're going to use this document object. And what that does, that just retrieves HTML from wherever you're looking at. So we always start off by saying document dot. Then we're going to look on the top. He tells us that the text box. So this text box is called SZ, and it's located in this form called F2. So we're going to retrieve the form. So we're going to call the form, and then within that form, we're going to call the text box, which is SZ. So what's happening is this document is saying, okay, I'm going to look in this form, and then within this form, I'm going to look in this text box. And then once I access it, I'm going to retrieve the value. Okay, so and then whatever that value is, we're going to store it in SZ. But we do need to make some adjustment to this because everything that you see on a web page, like I just mentioned earlier, is HTML. However, whatever number they put, we need to be able to use that as an integer number, right? Like we don't want it to be a string data type because everything on HTML is string. We need it to be a number. So we're going to have to convert SZ into the proper data type. And we do that by using this parse int property, and anything inside the scope of it just becomes a different, it just turns into an integer. And that should be familiar from Java whenever you have to like, you had those dialog boxes and you'd have to be using number and you would convert your string. Like if it was 10 as a string, it would turn into the actual number 10. But that is the first deliverable. Does anybody have any questions on like retrieving data and like the data types and things like that? Okay, if not, I will move on to the second question. So it says, if the value of SZ is even, then display an alert that says size must be odd. So, and then also set P2 underscore out. This is also our ID to an empty string. So what's nice here is that Dr. Parks tells us exactly what we need to do in order to, have this execute. He uses the word if. So that means whenever he does that, that means you're going to use an if statement. So let's open up our if statement, and we need to check. We need to, figure out a way that we can check for this number to be even. So the way we'll do that is there's this operator that's the, what is this, percentage sign, and I think it's called modulus, and basically it lets you do remainder division. And so we're going to see if the remainder of whenever like this number divided by 2, if that's equal to 0, that's going to be our condition. Because obviously if a number divided by 2 has remainder of 0, that means it's even. And if you're thinking like, how would I have thought of that? That's okay, because he tells us at the bottom right here, he gives us a note. If some number modulus 2 equals 0, then the number's even. So if you think like I probably wouldn't have thought of that or something, don't worry, because he gave us that hint. So let's go inside the if statement and let's have these two outputs. So we're going to create an alert that says size must be odd. And the way you do this is you literally just type alert. And then within the quotes, you can say size must be odd. Okay, so that creates that like box that we had. So this that's created using the alert property. And then we have to set P2 to an empty string. So the way that we're going to do that is we'll call our ID and we'll use this inner HTML property. And basically what that does is that whatever is stored, like whatever you set this equal to, it's going to display that onto your web page. So for us, it's just going to be empty string. All right. Does anybody, so that is the second deliverable. All we did was we made a check if the value that the user inputted was even. And if it was even, then we're going to have this output and then we'll have nothing come up on our web page. So does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, so now we're moving on to the third deliverable, and it is if the value of SZ is odd. So you know, with an if statement, there is an else statement as well. So if this thing isn't true, then perform the next thing. So we're going to create our else statement, and within the brackets of this else statement, you want to remember, once we're here, we've already established that the number is going to be odd. And that's important to remember once we get a few more steps into the question. But it says, if the value is odd, then produce an HTML table with SZ rows and SZ columns. And then if the table cell is in an odd number row or an odd number column, then set the width. So we're going to do some HTML attributes like changes depending on where in the table we're at. So let's just like put in an odd number to see. Okay, so we don't know what number the user is going to put, right? Like they could put 11, they could put like 102 or 103 or something. We don't know exactly, but we need to be able to create the table that, you know, matches the requirement of what that number is. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to create a for loop. And the reason why we're using a for loop is because we don't know like the exact number that we're going to be, like we don't know the exact number of how many times this will like execute, but there is a way that we can find that out and put that in our for loop so that it'll automatically populate these rows for us and we don't have to manually input a row for every single, like we don't have to put a row for every number because once again, we don't know what this number is. So let's just go in this for loop, and the way that we're going to communicate with our JavaScript what that number is at the user input, we're going to say I is less than that number. All right, so in this case, if SZ is 11, this is going to execute from 0 to 11. So it's going to execute 10 times. And then I plus plus. And remember, you can do this because earlier we had converted the data type. So SZ is an integer. So we can literally just say I is less than SZ. Does that make sense so far for everyone? Why we chose SZ?
Wouldn't it execute 11 times? Because you
Oh
said
yeah,
add a
0 to yeah, from 0 to 11, my bad. But does it make sense why we're using this number so that we know exactly how many rows to produce?
Yeah, makes sense.
All right, cool. So now we're inside this initial for loop. So let's open up our row. And before I do that, there's something that I forgot. Wait, where is it? Okay, right here, we wanted to open up our table. So there, we're going to create another variable OS. And here we're going to open up our table. And there are two attributes that you always do when you open up a table tag, and that is border and cell spacing. Cell spacing. So for Dr. Parks, he always likes your border to be 1 and your cell spacing to be 0. And you can do that, like you could do this at the very beginning or right when you get to this step. It's easy to establish all your variables. Like for me, it's easy to establish all my variables once I start a problem. So once I open up this table tag and I set it equal to OS, I can add a row tag. Okay. Oh wait, actually, instead of that, we're going to put it here. Okay. So we open up our row tag, and now once we're in the row, so we're at I is equal to 0. So we're going to open up our first row, and now we want to fill in all of the cells, and we want to make sure that we fill in the cell based off of this extra criteria that Dr. Parks gave us. So the way we're going to do that is create a nested for loop. So for, and what this for loop does is this for loop is going to focus specifically on those columns that we're making. So we can set it equal, we can say j is equal to 0 and j is less than, and we're going to follow the same logic we did with the first one, because it does say that we need to have the same number of rows and the same number of columns. So we can say j is less than, or yeah, j is also less than sz and j plus plus. And this is something I want to point out. This is why I said, like, in the beginning, one thing I want to cover is a nested for loop, is that whenever you're inside the scope of this for loop, it's going to run as many times as it's true. And then as soon as it exits, you have to remember you're still in the scope of this for loop. So right now we're at the first row, and we're going to make all the columns, and then we're going to stop making columns, and we're going to leave the row, and then we're going to come back to the second row. It might make more sense like once we have the rest of the code in there, but that's essentially how the nested for loop works. So okay, so we have created this nested for loop, and now we need to check if the cell is going to be gray, or if there's not going to be anything inside the cell. So he says again, if the table cell. So let's use an if statement. And before I say what the condition is, I'm going to put in the brackets what our output's going to be. So this is what our OS is going to equal. And this is the HTML attributes that are really important. You're going to see these very often whenever you're doing his midterm exams, especially. So the first one is setting the cell width and height to 15 pixels, set the cell background to the color light gray, and he gives us that attribute, and then place a single blank in the cell. So this is if this first condition is true. So before I write the condition, I want to show you guys what the output is, because the condition is a little bit confusing. So we'll start off with the output. So let's open up our cell, and the way that you add attributes is literally just writing that within the cell, like within the tag. So like for table, for example, with table, I wrote border and cell spacing all in this tag. So it knows throughout the entire table, include this formatting. Okay, so with TD, he tells us you want width and height to be 15. So we can just say width is equal to 15 and height is equal to 15 as well. All right. And then the last attribute is adding this background color of light gray. So BG color is equal to light gray. And you always put them in single quotations. And it doesn't show you an error if you put it in double quotations, like if I were to put light gray in double quotations, but it gets confusing because you have to put your tags in double quotations. And so it's just like easier to read and make sure your code is right when you keep everything within the scope of the tag in single quotes. Okay. And then he said to make sure that the single blank, like make sure the tag has a single blank. So we're going to close that tag, and then we're going to have a single blank. And then we're just going to open up our closing TD tag. So that's like these 3 steps right here are all done on this line. So does anybody have any questions about what's happened so far? All right. So now we're on the else part. So that is if the if statement is true. So let's go to the else statement. And it says create an empty cell. Okay, so we don't need to have the background colors. We do want to keep the width and height tag on there, even though he doesn't explicitly say it. You want to keep it since you specified it in the first one. And this table, obviously, everything is the same width and same height. So that is something that you need to specify in the else tag. And attributes are not required. You can open up rows, you can open up columns and tables without having attributes, but for formatting, that is when you include these attributes. So then we'll close the cell tag. Okay, so let's go back to this if statement. It says if the table cell is in an odd number row or an odd number column. So I used this as an example. I can make it full screen. So this is an example if the user put in 17. So there's 17 rows and 17 rows and 17 columns. So if we're trying to make sure that, you know, at row 1, it's all gray, row 3, row 5, you could easily say like, if whatever the number is, we can use that same logic, modulus 2 or 2 is equal to 0, then do this, right? And we're going to use the two variables that we created, or not variables, but the two conditions that we have here that represent our row and column. So I represented our rows, right? And we want to see if the rows are odd, then do a certain thing. So let's use I. And then there's another, this is a conditional operator, I believe. It is these two bars. I actually don't know if that's the right term, but with these two bars, you have two arguments, and if only one of the arguments needs to be true for this whole thing to be true. So you have two bars, and then there's also the two and signs. And with the and statement, both arguments on either side have to be true. But for us, we just want to see, because he does say, if it's in an odd number row or an odd number column. So it only needs to be in one. So we're going to say if the remainder of I divided by 2 is equal to 0, or if the remainder of j divided by 2 is equal to 0. But you're probably looking at this and you're thinking like, or maybe some of you guys are, some of you guys aren't. If you're looking at this and thinking, isn't this checking if it's even? Like, because then we use the same logic to check if the number was even. But if you look, all of the even like position numbers, so when I is equal to 0, we're actually at an odd row, an odd column. So you have to remember, since JavaScript is 0 indexed, the even number positions are actually representative of odd rows and odd columns. So that's why we can use the same logic for this second, for this if statement as well. Does that make sense to you guys, or do you want me to explain that again? All right, if it makes sense, I can keep on going because we're actually almost done with this exam. It's pretty quick. So basically, just to recap, if the position of I or j is even, corresponding to an odd row or an odd column, then perform this, create a cell that looks like this, or if not, then create a cell that looks like this. Okay, and I'll go back to the question. All right, so now we're going to leave the nested for loop. So we're still inside the main for loop, and we're going to close our row out. Okay. Extra space. So now, just to recap what's happening here, we are in this first for loop. And so at position like 0, for example, we opened up a row. And then while we're in the first row, we're going to start populating our columns. And the way we're going to populate them is by performing this check to see if we're at an odd row or an odd column. And if so, make it look, a certain way. And then we're going to close out the cell. And then once this is done being true, once we're done executing this, we'll close out our row. And then we'll just keep on continuing until we get to SC. So then once we leave the scope of that for loop, we can actually close out our table. And then it says place the table in the div with an ID equal to P2 underscore out. So similar to what we did up here, we're going to call that ID P2 underscore out dot inner HTML. And this time we're going to set it equal to OS because OS is holding all of our HTML. And that's what we want to have display on our web page. And that is all the code for this problem. Another thing that I want to mention is to make sure that you stay in the scope of this else statement when you are doing all of this. And I actually will put this inside there as well because we create the table when the SZ value is odd. So once we retrieved what the user had put, and we know if it is even, then it's going to do that, give us the alert and have an empty string. But if it's not even, then inside this entire else statement, create the table. And that is the entire question. So we'll copy it. Okay, so when you are downloading his exams to copy your code, you just save it as a web page. And I already have it saved on here. And this is his entire exam. So there's a lot of other formatting. These are the first question and the second question. So like I said, when we were doing our question, we put it under function P2. So he has the same thing. And we're just going to copy and put our code. And we'll open it in the browser. And there. And then if we put in an even number, size must be odd, and like that. So that is the entirety of this question. If you guys have any questions about what I did, where was it? Feel free to unmute and you can ask right now and I can go over anything again. And then also this little table I made, I did put it on the Miso app as well. If you guys need to refer to that again as well.
I do have a question. It's not about the code. So yeah, I was in his class yesterday and he was going over Canvas and rotating stuff and whatnot. But looking at his exams, none of that is being used. So do we really need to practice those things or no?
Yeah, so a lot of the lectures, he'll go off about things that aren't related. I'm going to say this about the midterm. With the midterm, a lot of the extra stuff he talks about, you don't need to know, which is why a lot of people didn't go to his class before the midterm, because he does go off on these tangents. And I know he talks about colors way too much. So based off of my midterm, none of the random things he talked about, especially for us, I remember he talked a lot about ASCII and Morse code. None of that shows up on your midterm. But for the final, I will say that he will include some random things that he talks about. So I highly recommend attending his classes. I mean, of course, I recommend you attend all of his classes, but particularly for all the classes leading up to the midterm, those extra concepts aren't relevant. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, because so when he went over HTML for on his website, there's that bare bones guide or whatnot. And I see that, some of the tags in there you're using table and the background color and whatnot. But when he went over HTML5 yesterday,
yeah,
what should we focus on HTML5, like specifically?
This is a HTML that this is, oh, he's went over bare bones guide, this one.
Yeah, that one I see that, you're using some tags from there, like the table tag and the background color tag and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. But
But
like,
then
are
he
you talking
went,
about this kind of
yeah,
stuff?
yeah, that stuff.
Okay, literally like none of it. Um, this is the one thing on his website that actually helped me prepare for the exam. Where is it? And it's annoying. It's kind of annoying because he goes over it the day before the exam, but this page is on the fly. This has all the actual HTML that he would ask you about in a multiple choice exam, as well as all the scripting. So, like the if statements and loops. And so, this was the one resource that I used on his entire webpage when I was in this class. And that's your review session. Like on this class, when you go, he will like review this for 30 minutes. But if you want to practice HTML, then I would refer to this link and not any of the other extra stuff.
Got you. And is that the same as the review on the top of the page?
I up here? Oh, this
Yeah,
midterms. Yeah. It is.
got you.
Mhm.
So I only know the stuff, the HTML stuff, which is on here.
Yeah, this was like, because there was HTML questions, and it would really just be like, okay, he's going to give you a tag. What's going to be the result? Like, what's going to show up on the web page if you, have this tag? Or if you're creating a list, like, which one's the right way to show a list with numbers or with bullet points, things like that. And another thing that I will say, oh wait, actually, before I get into that, does anybody have any questions about this code? Or if not, I can move on to the next part of what I wanted to do. All right, seems like y'all got it. So, okay. So answering the FAQs. Okay, yeah, I wrote these down. Let me stop sharing because, oh wait, before I actually do that, I can continue sharing and showing you guys. So if you go on the web page and you want to access the visuals, you go into the transaction processing folder, and the visuals for every exam I do coding time, I feel like sometimes it's easier if you look at what the output is instead of having to hear me like explain it. So that's why I will be creating visuals. That's what helped me last semester doing it for myself. So I decided to do that for you guys as well. And then another thing is, since he changed the format last semester, we didn't know anything like what he was going to ask us because that was the first time. But since I took it, I have a better idea. And so I'm going to be creating multiple choice questions for you guys. Every week is my goal, and I have them already up. And they're kind of like, they go over the concepts that were in the coding times for that week. And then some of them are just like general questions about HTML and JavaScript, because he does give you, he'll give you like a very basic example, and then you'll have to literally choose what answer is the right output. But in the beginning, just so that you guys can get the concepts down, there will be more like conceptual questions. But be sure to do that. And then if you ever want to go over them, I don't plan on going over these during my coding times, because like I mentioned, my coding times is for going over past exams. But you can always message me in either the group chat or private message me, and I can go over the questions with you. And I also created a calendar thing, like where you can choose a date and time if you want to have one-on-ones, because I am on campus pretty frequently, or if you want to do it through like Zoom or Teams or anything like that. And I can spend that time going over these questions with you guys or going over an exam again. So feel free to like utilize these. This one is for free week, but after that, they will be only for members. And I know like it's easy to just screenshot and send it to your friends, but I advise against that because, y'all paid for this, and that's not fair if people who didn't pay for it are getting access to those resources. And we're doing this for our members. We're not just like out here doing this for fun. This is for you guys. But it is fun because it's for you guys.